We're waiting for Elon to work his magic.
The tunnel.
Adam, do you need a?
No, for his satellite.
No, I'm gonna wing it.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
live.
Live. Okay, we're live. We're live.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the State Historical Resources Commission workshop on multiple property documentation. My name is Adam Serro. I am representing archaeology on the commission. I live in Culver City, and I am on the workshop committee. In the past, we have had a number of informative workshops that we've put together, not only for commissioners, but also the general public. Those past workshops include tribal perspectives on National Register nominations, archaeology, the policy and politics and rules and regulations around National Register nominations, as well as a lot of information on the California Historical Resources Information System and the data migration that it's been going through over the last several years. Today, we are lucky enough to have the award-winning staff from the California Office of Historic Preservation present on multiple property documentation, a tool that we use regularly to create a baseline of a nomination that then allows people to have a little less of an effort when putting together associated nominations under that larger umbrella. So without taking any more wind out of the sails of this incredible staff, I will hand it over to them to begin. There will be 3 segments, 30 minutes each, with questions after, and you will not see us talking. They'll switch over to the presentation itself, and then we'll move back over to the OWL for questions and comments. Any thoughts here? Oh, introductions, thank you. But before we do that, why don't we go through introductions around the table? I'll just move it to my right.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Julie Blanco. I have the honor of being your State Historic Preservation Officer. I'm just going to introduce staff for expediency. We have Tara Lynch, our Chief Counsel to my right, Jody Brown, our Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and Tribal Liaison. Amy Crane and William Berg will be with us from the registration unit. Monica and Caleb, our support team, are in the room with us, who have helped us with the logistics for today. And I'll turn it back to you to have the commissioners introduce themselves.
Great. Commissioner Hess, would you like?
My name is Alan Hess. I'm an architect and I represent architectural history on the commission. I am from Irvine.
Hi, I'm Neil Payton. I'm from Santa Monica, California, and I'm an architect representing architecture.
My name is Lee Adams. I'm from Downeyville in Sierra County, and I represent the public on the commission.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me also say that these workshops are meant for commissioners to be better at what they do. We learn from staff who, pretty much run things and put the packages together for us in a way that allows us to understand the nature and context of these nominations. And so listening to them makes us do our job better. And that's one of the main goals of putting these workshops together. So with that.
Thank you. Jody, do we have anybody on this one? Okay. That's a good idea.
My name is William Berg, historian too, with the Office of Historic Preservation Registration Unit, and the Historic Preservation of multiple property documentation.
William, can you speak up? It's hard to hear you.
Multiple property documentation, part 1, creating a multiple property document.
Okay, my name is Amy Crane, also a state historian too in the registration unit. And we're going to start out with the big picture. So the multiple property documentation form gives that umbrella that Adam referenced. So it provides cover documentation. So multiple nominations can be submitted under that cover. They'd be related by theme, geographical area, period of time. And we'll get into some more specifics and examples later on. This is actually a format that was introduced by the National Park Service in 1984. And we have used this process successfully in our office over the last several years. So there you have what it is. And my remote is not necessarily working. Oh, there we go. So a few thoughts about what a multiple property documentation form is not. It's not a nomination in and of itself. It needs to be accompanied by at least one nomination. Whereas a property that goes through the whole process is eventually listed or determined eligible by the keeper of the National Register, keeper action in this case would be cover documentation approved. Based on experience that we've had, we thought we'd comment on a few of the issues that we've seen over the past few years. It is not a nomination of every potentially eligible property that's called out in the documentation form. There's also not a district nomination. And although it is sometimes referenced as a context statement, the term context or historic context, that's actually a component. So one other item here, again, back to the fact that it's not a district, it can facilitate the nomination of what might otherwise be a large district or a district that might be discontiguous, comprised of physically unrelated parts. And again, we'll get back into more detail on that later.
Now, the multiple property documentation form differs significantly from a National Register nomination. And the basic components of a form are one or more historic contexts, identifying what sorts of properties and what areas of history are nominated with the multiple property document, and also one or more property types, which are the types of properties identified in the context, beyond the context, but what properties are actually able to be nominated. And also there need to be related property types that exist or are likely to exist. So a multiple property document is generally not used for a single property because there's only a single property of that context. And it's also generally not used to identify all of the properties that can be nominated under that context because there may be unknown properties, but which have a historic context. And the idea of a multiple property document is that it is open-ended. And in addition to the single property or several properties nominated alongside the multiple property documentation form, that subsequent nominations can be made using the same context. This was the case in the example shown here, the Architectural Resources of Auburn, which was submitted with a number of individual nominations, but subsequent nominations were submitted over time. Multiple property document form also requires two things. The theme, which is one or more broad areas of significance, which is broader than a single area of significance using National Register criteria, because you could apply to multiple areas of significance within the larger theme, and then a place, which is an extent that defines the area within properties can be nominated. We'll talk more about that when we get to the scope of nominations, but in this case, the example is Fair Glen Additions, which is one of several tracts that were developed by Joseph Eichler and the city of San Jose, and it was nominated under the cover of the housing tracts of Joseph Eichler in San Jose. Now, Joseph Eichler did tracts throughout the state of California, but based on the framework set by this multiple property document, only Eichler tracts within the city of San Jose are able to be nominated, so those are the established boundaries of the NPDF. Historic context there are three main approaches for historic context. Thematic approach, which the idea is a general historic theme. Association is very often an association with events or with individuals as the guiding principle for the context, or a geographic approach, one that is constrained by the physical geography of the property types, or a chronological approach with several periods over time. In this case, The city of Pasadena, in a lot of ways, is a champion of nominating multiple property documents for their architecture. They've submitted MPs not only for late 19th and early 20th century architecture, but also for the arts and crafts movement and for the modern movement. And they've submitted a few others, each with multiple individual properties, which the idea was that none of these properties were contiguous. They weren't a district, but to have a clear path to be able to identify types within, again, limited geographically to the city of Pasadena. Background information for historic contexts. Now, the historic contexts have to be related to historic or prehistoric trends and patterns. An individual or group of individuals. There are a lot of ways these parallel the National Register criteria, but they don't match exactly. Art, architecture, engineering, and landscape architecture, or prehistoric and historical archaeology. The example here is a statewide context for Carnegie libraries throughout California. It's one of the older multiple property documents that has been occasionally used to nominate subsequent Carnegie libraries, in this case one in Livermore, California. Property types. Each property there can be multiple property types submitted under cover of a multiple property document, but the idea is that they are related thematically and historically or architecturally to the governing historic context. So each property type has to have a description of what sort of properties and physical characteristics of the property, guidelines for selection, using National Register criteria to identify significance under which properties can be nominated, and then registration requirements for each property type. In this case, the property is the one property nominated under cover of the Historical and Archaeological Resources of Rock 66 MPDF, which was a roadside motel, which is one of the property types identified in that MPDF. Geographical data, the scope of a MPDF. There's going to be local within a single city or even a portion of the city, statewide, like the Carnegie Library example given already, or national. Some MPDFs are national in scope, so anywhere in the United States could use these. These are examples of a property or actually 4 different properties that were nominated by a current member of the commission. The Downeyville Bridges, which were nominated under cover of the Historic Highway Bridges of California MPDF. Another nomination was originally submitted by Caltrans that has occasionally been used to nominate properties. The summary of identification and evaluation methods is not quite a context, it's not quite a bibliographic essay or a historiography, but it is included in a way to summarize the methods used within that MPDF to gather the information, to analyze the areas of history, and this is an area where you can get at the heart of a nomination rather than the technical aspects of what it's nominating, but very often the approaches and methodology used by the historians or archaeologists who created it. And the example is the Elrod House, nominated under cover of the residential architecture of John Lautner in Southern California, MPDF. The registration requirements is the 10900B form, which is unique to MPDFs. Then, as we mentioned, it begins with a statement of historic context, which identifies themes within those contexts, a list of associated property types and property type descriptions, geographical data, which identifies the outer boundaries for which properties can be nominated under that cover, the summary of identification evaluation methods, bibliographic references. Now, a MPDF cannot be nominated by itself. It has to be accompanied by a nomination. We'll talk more about how to nominate a property in the third part of this presentation. And then, of course, like any other nomination, it requires a cover letter and digital file. So the example given was one of the properties nominated under the 20th century California MPDF NFWA headquarters in Vallejo. And that PDF is listed in much the same way that a nomination is reviewed through once it's received by our office. The historic context are reviewed as well as the property types. The individual nomination or nominations that accompany it are reviewed by staff. and they undergo hearing by the State Historical Resources Commission, and then for final review and approval by the keeper. This concludes part one, so I'll turn on the camera. If there are questions from the commissioners or from the public.
William, if I can, just quick question. Who usually initiates this process? Is it from the outside, or somebody applies for something and OHP staff says, hey, there could be a lot more of these out there. This ought to be a multi-property. How does this usually begin?
Very often they're carried out by the same parties that would do nominations. So they could be local governments, they could be individuals or organizations. In some cases, there are federal agencies that have submitted MPDFs. We'll talk about some examples of those. And then what we're going to really do the deeper dive in part two is the ones that were initiated through the Office of Historic Preservation.
Thank you. Thanks.
So this could apply to kind of a specific building type, right? But I'd like to say I'm just thinking out loud, and maybe these exist even. Let's say 1950s gas stations, let's say. Could you make one out of that? You know, like, the Zoopy ones.
So the idea of space age architecture.
Yeah.
Architecture, it would generally have to be constrained. Gas stations as a whole.
No, I don't mean gas stations as a whole, but like the space age gas stations. Could you?
If you could identify a clear context for those types of gas stations, and it's certainly something where there is established literature and writing. In some cases, they're like the Route 66 gas stations actually are a type, but they have to be adjacent to Route 66, whereas if the idea is gas station architecture, programmatic and thematic architecture, that would also need to be defined. And the broader the scope, both the geographic scope and the types of properties, obviously the more complex and detailed the MPDF would have to be. So by a more constrained approach of a particular type, say a particular company or a particular architect or a particular school of architecture, that would...
Well, like Phillips 66 was associated with this kind of space agey looking gas station. That was their theme. Also thinking about like airports, not commercial airports, but like, there's an aircraft industry, there was a bigger aircraft industry in California, right? And there were aircraft related buildings, whether they're Quonset huts or hangars or that are kind of interesting, or even old terminals that like Long Beach or Burbank, and there might be others that were, and that's a big part of California history, right? And this is not a coherent thought yet, but it's a brainstorm. But is it theoretically possible that you could make something out of that? I'm not asking you to commit to it.
Yes, it's theoretically possible.
I guess if I can
Yeah,
follow up, what would then be the purpose? Okay, so let's say we can, do small airports of the early aviation industry. What might be the value or purpose of it to be an MPD?
There are two. Number one is that, as we'll see in section 3, it simplifies the process of nominating subsequent properties. And it also adds, this is actually mentioned in Bulletin 16B, which covers the multiple property approach, is it serves an educational purpose in providing information about this area of history. And in some cases, I'm not aware of statewide aviation MPDFs, but there are a couple of states that have railroad-based MPDFs. And the idea is that there are a lot of railroad architecture bits and pieces that are physically separated from the rest of the existing railroad system. And rather than try to individually nominate them using the traditional approach, if they're already identified, so not only does it allow people who want to nominate them to know what to look for and what kind of properties might be eligible. It also has applications for cultural resource management and people who want to look at and see what kind of properties might I encounter in the field related to railroads or airports or whatever the historic context is that might require a closer look during the environmental review process or for potential rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna ask what bulletin NPS had, but you already answered that in your answer here. Because it essentially is a larger effort, it seems, to capture something that has a bigger theme. Does the registration unit see these coming in where you need to have more scrutiny because it's actually meant to cover more properties by design?
No, I'd say it probably gets our same detailed level of evaluation. I mean, we may consult with each other, we may consult with our reviewer at the National Park Service if we have questions, but I don't think they require a different level of review because I think we're already giving everything that comes in a very detailed review.
Sometimes they do take a little more time because they are more exhaustive. They're, especially for example, for a citywide multiple property document, they will include far more detailed histories of the city where they're located to talk about development patterns, architectural use, and the growth of that city, versus an individual nomination may have maybe just a couple paragraphs at most of background information about the city instead of focusing on the individual property. The difference is that the historic context is located within the MPDF rather than in the individual nomination. And so part of the value is, again, being able to do subsequent nominations that are relatively simple and that are geographically discrete, that wouldn't work as a district.
Is there an expiration on an NPDF or the historic context statement within? Would we want to like revisit them over time, or?
They don't expire, but they are revisited. We're going to be talking about amendments later in the program.
And just to answer one more question about just sort of maybe the degree of detail or the time commitment, volume is definitely a size. Because a regular nomination might be 40 or 50 pages, 80 if it's really complex. The first half of the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in California multiple property documentation form was about 200 pages. The additional two contexts, the additional group, that added almost another 200 pages. So, there we have a 400-page document that obviously takes a bit more time, both for us to review and prepare for presentation to you. And then, of course, it's asking a lot of you. And when the amended AAPI multiple property documentation form went into the keeper staff, they specifically asked me, well, have you added things to all these interim? Or, can you tell me which pages
Show me the
are
track
brand
changes.
new so
Yeah.
that, maybe he didn't have to go back and reread the first 200 pages. So,
Understood, thank you.
Two other, I'm sorry, this is new to me, so I have a number of questions. If something were to, let's say you could identify a sort of thing that tended to be associated with an ownership group, but there were many, many, many of them, and they all kind of had a similar characteristic. Would you have to have the buy-in of the ownership group?
I'm not sure what you mean by ownership group.
Well, let's say Phillips 66 was still a business. I don't think it is anymore, but if it was, and they owned all those stations, and you were really focused on that kind of thing, and they were like 80% of the ones you saw were from them, would you have to go to them and say, you okay with this, or what?
there's no nomination.
I see.
Again, this is what I referenced and what it
All right.
isn't. I mean, you can mention a number of properties that may be eligible that in the future could be nominated
Got
on
it.
the cover of this document, but they're not actually being nominated by the action of writing and approving the cover documentation. So it would be helpful to do some outreach. It would be very interesting to get their input because they probably have files that maybe aren't available to anybody else.
But not
But
required.
there is no reason for them to be concerned that someone's taking action on their property by the means of preparing a document like this.
Could this apply to landscapes or wilderness areas that you could somehow find a theme that connected, I don't know, different?
Absolutely. One of my examples are the Northern California dog hole ports.
And then
Maritime landscapes.
the Route 60, sorry, this is the last question, I promise. Route 66, obviously, went to a lot of states. So it's kind of a national thing, but this is just for California, right?
There were multiple Route 66 MPDFs for each state that it ran through. So the California, the MPDF that I mentioned is strictly for Route 66 resources in this state. But there are, like I said, there are national ones, and there are examples that some that are currently in process of.
Who puts together the national, let's say you saw a type or something, but there were some of these in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, whatever. Who, and you thought together it's even more impressive, you know, like who would put that together?
Well, what state can take the lead?
I see.
There's actually one under review right now where the state of Colorado took the lead.
I see.
And there's a total of 6 states that have this particular trail that passes through. And the National Park Service said it was up to each of the other states' SHPOs whether they wanted to sign as commenting official or whether they wanted to take it to their state review board. And of the 5 other states, it's been split about half and half. A couple just signed off, a couple took it to their board. We're still waiting for an answer on a particular question, and hopefully we'll actually come before you on the November agenda if everything gets resolved that needs to be. So again, one state takes the lead and the others are brought in and they can determine how much review, how much comment they want to have on that project.
But also, the National Park Service has taken the lead on national NPDFs, like the Latinos in the 20th Century was initially a national effort run by the National Park Service or contracted by the National Park Service. And from that national theme study, California did a statewide version of it. And then the city and county of Los Angeles did a local government version of it. So we riffed off of the nationwide one to say, this is what's happening in the nation. We want to know specifically what's happening in California. And then the city and county of Los Angeles said, great, we want to know what's happening at the city level. So they did their own as well. So there are other entities like the National Park Service who will take the national lead. Speaking the multi-state one that Amy is talking about that Colorado took the lead on, I think it's actually an entity in Colorado, not the SHPO itself. We each of the 6 states have the option of bringing it to the commission, or the SHPO can sign off. I think it's really important for the commission to hear these, so we'll bring it to all of you when we've deemed that it's ready. That we're asking questions about if they've consulted with Indian tribes on this one, because it's a theme study that would be of particular interest to tribes, and we didn't have any evidence of any consultation with tribes.
Just a comment, I'm looking at the list of multiple property submissions in California, and there appears to be an oversight. We have them for architecture for Albert Fry, E. Stewart Williams, John Lautner, but I don't see one for the architecture of Alan Hess.
Well,
I'm not done yet.
he's still.
That's great.
I had a question. Please. You mentioned the context includes property types, but then you also said related property types. What would be the distinction?
The property types related to that context. So that's what we mean, the related property types, and then there are individual property types in a list. So it could be, for Route 66, there are gas stations, there are nature areas, there are motels, restaurants, and other kinds of
so subcategories.
Subcategories.
Okay.
Rather than a single list.
Just one thing quickly, because we're recording this for everybody else to watch at a different time. NPS is National Park Service, and Keeper is the keeper of the National Register, who is responsible for actually doing the listing of properties on the National Register. So we should be careful about acronyms. Thank you.
And before we move on, I believe Caleb had a question.
I think it was sort of commented on already, like if it involves other states, like I think they already answered that, but I guess to clarify, if it's relevant to like an immediate vicinity, such as on a state boundary, for example, the Lake Havasu region of California, Arizona, is it still left to a particular state, or would there be more collaboration or even a joint submission of an NPDF for each state?
The answer is it depends on which state actually initiates the process, but typically they communicate with the other states involved to work out a process. And the National Register units in each state, we do communicate, so we have ways to get in touch and set up that kind of discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more quick one. If you have a property on federal land, solely on federal land, it goes through their federal preservation officer, and it doesn't come to the commission for review. But if that property is being nominated under an MPDS, do you then change the purview of the property on federal land? Or does it still stay with that FIPO?
Federal nominations are reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office as a commenting authority, so they provide a letter, we have a review process and a letter of concurrence, but rather than, so it would not necessarily go to the commission.
Okay, even though there's a MPDS that the commission has reviewed?
Not necessarily. If it's entirely federal, and I have an example later on, the commission wouldn't see it. Unless there was a concurrent property. If there was a district that had both federal and private lands,
Right.
then that nomination and its related MPDF would come before the commission.
Okay.
And for the second session, we were using headphones at first, but we're going to try not to avoid being distracted by the echoes that we hear in our headphones. So we're just going to speak, and if anyone who's watching online has difficulty hearing, let us know in the chat.
Raise your hand.
Will that affect the recording though?
No, it'll all be picked up on the recording.
Thank you for answering questions.
Part two. In the state of California, in 1988, the California Office of Historic Preservation produced a document called 5 Views. The idea was an ethnic historic site survey for California, including indigenous people, African Americans, Chinese and Japanese Americans, and Latinos. And it was a comprehensive survey, including lists of properties associated with each of these groups, with a conclusion at the end that the state of California should make a more proactive effort to identify and list properties of these sorts. Fast forward to 25 years later, and there was still a promise from 5 Views, but it hadn't yet been delivered. And so during this period, around the early 2010s, there were nominations that were received within these contexts, such as Chicano Park, which actually, after its listing in the National Register, it was also made a National Historic Landmark. Or Shiloh Baptist Church in Sacramento, associated with African Americans, which is listed in the National Register, and they were submitted as conventional nominations. So in addition to just the basic information, some cases they might even use 5 Views as a bibliographic reference, but they had to be submitted as a full nomination with their own individual historic context. And that changed with one of the first of the statewide historic contexts that were initiated by this office, the Latinos of 20th Century California.
And what you see here is actually the cover of a print publication that was created as a separate process once the multiple property documentation form was finished. It was heavily illustrated. We actually had a staff member who went out and sought out just a very large volume of photographs and getting permissions for those, and it was funded separately. Since then, we really entered the full digital age, and all of our finished multiple property documentation forms have been listed on the website and are fully available in digital format, and we'll provide some links at the end of the session.
Oh my God, it's yellowing on the edge. The book is yellowing on the edge, it's so old.
The first nomination that was submitted alongside this NPDF was the Intercultural Council Houses, which was submitted by a third party, not by our office. But because it seemed like a worthwhile nomination, but it didn't include enough context information specifically on its own. By making it an NPDF in consultation with the original applicant, it was what allowed the statewide that multiple property document to move forward. And it was the first nomination listed under that context.
So this actually circles back to one of the questions that Lee asked a few minutes ago, that what's happening, where are these coming from? And this is a list off of the OHP website. It It includes a lot of the earlier multiple property documentation forms, and actually the earliest ones were identified with a TR for thematic resources. And William has annotated this, indicating where, in most cases, there weren't any additional nominations that came in after the original submittal. In some cases, there were 1 or 2. And when we first started discussions of doing a statewide grant-funded multiple property documentation form, I remember our grants officer saying, are these going to get used? Because he felt like historically they hadn't been. And so we as staff have really made an effort over the last several years to make these really useful, accessible documents. And so that starts out with, again, Latinos in 20th century California. There are about a dozen nominations that we've seen over the last several years. This list was partially enhanced by a number of years ago. There were some grant funds available that went out to certified local governments to have them prepare nominations that could be associated with the context in the Latinos in 20th century California document. So that some of those are included here. And we have an additional set of nominations under review right now related to the Chicano walkouts, also known as the Chicano blowouts in East Los Angeles. And Hazard Park is also related to those, but it's going to come in as a separate nomination from a different applicant. Okay, sorry, I'm getting a little delay on my screen, so it's not quite matching. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in California was a multiple property documentation form for which I was the project lead. So I have taken even more of an interest in making sure that any nomination that comes in that has a potential association, that can be made. So this is what we have so far listed or determined eligible, and we have a lot more under review or even under consideration. And in some cases, a nomination will come in without any mention of the multiple property document. And in many cases, it's pretty easy for us to add the necessary information on the first page in the nomination form, and then to assist the applicant with making the case, indicating under which context it's eligible, how does it meet the registration requirements, and William will get to some of those specifics later in this session. So just making sure that these are really available, really accessible. I've actually had a couple of recent email inquiries where it's very obvious that the properties could be submitted in association with this form, and so I've been able to provide them with a link to the webpage that talks about the process, about the creation of this multiple property document, and a link specifically to the document itself. So for those of you who have been with us the last few years worth of commission meetings, you might recognize a number of these images. So now we're going to talk a little bit about designing a multiple property documentation form. And here again, we're focusing on the ones that have been state sponsored, where staff has been actively involved initially as reviewers, and then over the last few years as more taking the lead on actually working with the consultants, working with the applicants, working with the advisory committees to pull these documents together. So as the Chapeau mentioned, Latinos in 20th century California, it closely followed the national theme study. It was a very linear outline. There were 4 major bullet points, and each of those had 3 or 4 sub-bullet points, and we basically copied that exact format, those individual historic contexts. When it came to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it was a very different approach because we were working with 8 different groups. It was inspired by the national theme study, which had been much more of an essay approach. I believe there were 20 or 21 essays, so we didn't have the ability to go down that linear outline, so it became much more of a holistic, organic, trying to figure out how we were gonna pull all these different nationalities and community groups together. African Americans in California was able to go back a bit more to the more linear approach, again, complementing the national theme study, but using that more linear outline. And then when it came to Native Americans in the California mission system, again, we were kind of creating something completely new. We were working more to really focus on the perspective from the Native Americans. And so it was a very different process, a very different approach with a different outcome. So we'll come back to that just in a moment. I just sort of wanted to loop back to some of the earlier ones. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, when our initial approach incorporated the first 8 of these cultural communities, and then the amendment added Vietnamese Americans. The initial approach had the first 3 associated historic contexts, and then the amendment brought in the additional 2. And I believe the shipper wanted to speak a bit more to the Native Americans and California mission system documentation as the individual among us most closely involved with this process.
Thanks, Amy. So this multiple property document effort followed the framework that we used for Latinos in the 20th century and Asian Pacific and Asian Pacific Islanders in California, and the same for the African American context statement, in the sense that we had outreach to communities around the state to create an advisory committee that would sit with us and with our contractor or consultant who was helping us do the writing, to really provide that community-led and community-driven voice about themes, about possible properties to nominate. So they were all similar in that regard, and it's a framework that's unique to our state, I think, in the sense that we have these advisory committees made up of community members and organizations that we use when we write them. So we're just not writing them from Sacramento without a lot of knowledge about what's happening on the ground in our big state. But for this one, we reached out to the California Native American Heritage Commission, who keeps, among other things, works with the tribes and has a list of the tribes in California that self-identify with geographic areas important to them throughout the state. And from there were about 60 tribes that had self-identified as having an association or relationship with the 21 California missions. We went on a campaign to have listening sessions around the state with the tribes, both north, central, and south, that were co-hosted by tribal partners with us, to really talk about what this effort was, what we were hoping to do, and answer any questions from the tribal communities. That effort took a couple of years, and resulted in 19 tribes deciding that they would like to participate with us on the advisory committee. We had a consultant that did the writing, but the tribes were the primary source. And this is what's a little bit different than the others. There was an extensive sort of document research that was done about what kind of literature existed. But the main focus of this effort were the tribes, their stories, the stories of their ancestors, and their experience as the primary source of the history for this document and for the themes. We had a consultant that helped with our staff doing the writing. And what was also unique about it, and one of the things that we really were striving to look at, is how do the way that tribes hold their history, how does that interplay and fit in or not with the National Register framework? Like, where were those possibilities for that interface? Where were the challenges, and how were we going to overcome them or deal with them to elevate the number of possible properties on the National Register that were tribal led and from the tribal voice? So it was a big undertaking. We had amazing partners. At one point, when we had the document that was to be submitted to the keeper of the National Register, the tribes themselves provided the documentation for the themes and the stories that were maybe a little bit different than the normal format. And so in this case, we worked with the keeper of the register and their staff to put a sort of introductory paragraph in that section of the document that explained that what followed was from the voice of the tribes unedited. So we didn't edit it, we didn't take anything, it wasn't our history. And so it was a way to make a compromise from the normal path of scholarship on the other ones to really think about how we can incorporate into this framework histories that were told differently, that were more oral in nature, and from that first person or the descendant of the first person experience. And that's reflected in this document very differently than any other multiple property documents that we've seen, as well as it's probably one of few, if it's not the only one in the country that does that. The National Park Service has told us they're very happy to see it, and they're hoping that it'll serve as a model for others. Now, there aren't as many stories as we would have liked to have. Some of the tribes were more participatory than others because of several things, including the fact that they have lots of reviews to do under the state and federal laws. We've also been contacted by tribes who want to now add themes to it. And then finally, we have an arrangement with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officers Association of California to do an outreach and education opportunity with the tribes themselves about the document, to let people know that it exists and how to use it and to answer questions. So we're hoping that with that effort, we will see more nominations under this document. The nomination that came with it was an update to La Purísima mission, one of the three that is not church owned by California State Parks, and Parks graciously allowed us to update their nomination form. At the same time, they were also updating their National Historic Landmark document form, so we coordinated, our office, and State Parks coordinated with the National Park Service and National Historic Landmarks group to update those at the same time. So it was really, truly a very new experiment, if you will. And I'm hoping that we will continue to build upon it with the tribes and use it as a model to encourage and to elevate some of those stories that have not been traditionally told in this framework.
One other note I would add to that is that as part of the process, it was explicitly discussed in the advisory committee meetings that these would be public documents. And so often when we have tribal histories and archaeological nominations, they tend to be redacted or even restricted because that information is very privately valued by the tribes. And sometimes we can have a wonderful nomination and yet it's not available to use as a template or an example or information that can be publicly shared. So part of this process was to create a document that could be made accessible to anybody who wanted to see it. So whether it's tribes, whether it's some of our state park colleagues who may have mission property within state park boundaries, or anybody else who might want to use this. And it may serve as a precedent for some of our colleagues in other states. So really quite groundbreaking in a number of different ways.
Yeah, and such great credit to our tribal partners and participants for really going on a journey they didn't know, we didn't know, nobody knew. There were many conversations where we had to sort of go back and sort of figure out where we fell off the trail and come back again. But we did it together, and they were just amazing. And really this little tiny but mighty document is a testimony to really making sure that we're finding every opportunity to tell untold stories in the National Register context.
African Americans in California, NPDF. Now this also complements a National Park Service African American Heritage Theme Study, which was completed in 2008. And as mentioned earlier, the themes and context were based on precedent established by previous NPDF projects. And one thing that was emphasized by the initial study group as well as the consultant was the importance of having this be a comprehensive California approach, rather than being limited to a focus on major cities, but talking about rural California, talking about African Americans in California agriculture, in extraction industries, mining and logging from the gold rush through the 20th century. and covering areas that otherwise might not have been included. This was also, I'm not sure how many of the other MPDFs, but this was a project that was done during the age of Zoom. So there were actually multiple webinars, and because of the multiple
We out of
opportunities.
that age? Are we out of that age yet?
And I think we're still in it,
Okay.
but having this relatively new tool, rather than having groups to where we'd have to have everybody travel and meet maybe once or twice to review the documents, there were multiple opportunities for the stakeholder group that we assembled throughout the state to provide comments, to provide feedback. Many of those discussions really changed the directions of the research and prompted more proactive responses. Some of the documents and some of the information we produced as far as how many properties were actually listed as a result of our previous project. So the part we didn't have answers for those, but the questions that we were asked by these members of the public, and these are museum professionals and CRM professionals from throughout the state, really took us to task and tried to create a more comprehensive product. And the end result was, I think, a better document that was improved because of the methods of greater public participation, which are available to us now. And so there was no money in that grant for actual nominations, but there was already a nomination in our office that had an African-American context that needed help, and that was the Santa Barbara St. Paul AME Church. And by being able to associate this particular nomination with this context, we had our one nomination needed for the MPDF. And at the same time, folks in Oakland were working on a National Register nomination for their Southern Pacific Depot, which was also the headquarters for the Pullman Porters Union on the West Coast, and its president, C.L. Dellums. So we had a second nomination to go with it. And so these two properties have been listed, which ended up listing the MPDF, and we're now in receipt of a third nomination with more on the way.
So we're going to talk about designing a multiple property documentation form. Some of the earlier ones that came in that William and I have reviewed in our past 15 or 16 years were associated with the architect. As Commissioner Adams referenced, Albert Frey, John Lautner, E. Stewart Williams. So I've got a couple of sample images here. In both cases of the Frey and the Williams multiple property documents, the cover document came in accompanied by almost all of the individual nominations. We've had a couple of follow-ons over the later years, but again, rather than doing the cover document and one nomination, it was the cover document and almost all of the nominations. You might also choose to design a multiple property documentation form based on place. We've had cover documents come in for resources in Auburn, resources in Martinez, and California State Parks. The full name of this CCC in California State Parks is actually the National State Park Cooperative Program and the Civilian Conservation Corps in California State Parks, 1933 to 1942. And here I have a photo of the Mount Tamalpais Mountain Theater. One of the other properties nominated was the Morro Bay State Park Campground. And we actually had a request for that nomination from a colleague in Georgia. So, clearly these nominations are getting out there beyond just the state of California. We can also look at basing a multiple property documentation form on the type of property. Case study houses, Carnegie libraries, the dog hole ports, highway bridges, and ranching resources. So I did want to mention, just as almost every rule or guidance seems to have some sort of an exception to it. And for us, that has proven to be the Northern California Dog Hole Ports Maritime Cultural Landscapes multiple property document, because whereas in most cases, accompanying nominations can be quite brief, they haven't applied that. And the 4 nominations that we've seen so far have come in between 80 and 100 pages each. So they're still working off of some consolidated significance in the multiple property documentation form, but they haven't felt the need to abbreviate the nomination in any way. Okay, and the last slide we have in this section comes back to that federal multiple property documentation form, which is for historic ranching resources within Mojave National Preserve. Approximately 1 million acres, over 1,000 resources were inventoried beginning in 2001 in approximately 141 locations. And the property was originally proposed for designation in 2007 as a single district, the Rock Springs Land and Cattle Company Historic District. Over a period of several years, we had multiple conversations with the applicant, who was a retired NPS historian, working with the archaeologist at Mojave National Preserve and with our reviewer in Washington, D.C. And in the end, the multiple property documentation approach really made the most sense. This area was in use as a cattle range from the 1880s to 2001. Between 1928 and 1931, the original ranch was broken up and succeeded by Valley View Ranch, Kessler Springs Ranch, and OX Ranch. And you can see those boundaries indicated on this map. And to date, the multiple property approach facilitated the nomination and listing of 24 properties to date, and we have additional nominations in development. So there is actually an amendment that's been under review that will add an additional context and enable the park to add a number of additional nominations. So it even works at the federal level. And that brings us to the end of this section, if there are questions at this time.
I have a question. You were saying that the question of, are these being used? Do they inspire other nominations? And you mentioned that the Asian American, that one, and the African American one in particular has. And that seems to be the purpose of the whole program. So can you speculate as to why those did inspire, a sufficient number of nominations? Is there something we should learn there about how it's disseminated, or the way it's written, or you said, to be accessible?
I think, having them on our website and being able to direct people to them makes them sort of more easily accessible. When William and I answer inquiries about properties that we think could be associated, we specifically provide people with that access. In the Asian Americans multiple property document, we added 2 appendices. Appendix A is a list of potentially eligible properties, there are a couple that were identified for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders sort of more generally, and then under each of the cultural community groups, there's a pretty extensive list of potentially eligible properties. And then Appendix B is a 2-page guide on how to use the multiple property documentation form. So the idea was that people, for example, who were on the advisory committee or had some connection to people on the advisory committee could basically have a look at this document, and if they're not a preservation professional, but maybe somebody who's aware of a particular resource, or they've got some family history associated with something, that they don't have to go and spend thousands of dollars to hire a consultant, but they themselves could follow the guidance and submit a relatively modest, straightforward nomination and still achieve that result of getting the historic designation and, the honor and whatever might affect it could convey as well.
I remember that appendix with a list of all those things, and the more we could do to get that out there so that people can recognize it would be great.
I think it's also just a matter of awareness. Like, I think a lot of people don't know what they are and don't know how to use them. So outreach, one of the things that we hope to do more of in this office in the coming years is education and outreach, which is part of our job that we just don't get to spend a lot of time on anymore. But I think that the more that we can let people know that they exist and how to use them, the more they'll be used. Because they're an amazing resource for people to get nominations and not have to do the scholarship parts already finished. So it's a faster and a better way for communities who don't have that in-house expertise to be able to tap into these documents and nominate properties that are important to their communities.
I have a few questions. One is, so when you went through the one on Asian American and Pacific Islanders, there were two buildings in there which I was very familiar with, the Royal Theater and University High School, which I assume is the one in LA. I like the buildings, they're very nice. Clearly I can see why they're on the register, but I had no idea that they have any connection. I mean, I believe you, but I don't know that. And I don't know if there's any like plaque or anything anywhere that says that. Like, as a member of the just general public, is it possible for me to easily find out that these buildings have a connection to the Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders in California? Is that somehow something I could access? Information.
If you were looking, well, let's use University High School Administration Building as an example. If you put some or all of those words into the search term on the Office of Historic Preservation website, it would take you to the actions taken page of the commission action. It was at the May meeting. And there's a photograph and a small blurb that describes, and when we're working with a nomination that's been submitted under cover of one of these multiple property documents, it's almost always referenced in that little blurb. You can click on the link, which takes you to the draft nomination. And the very first page of the nomination has a place to identify the associated multiple property submission. So there are ways to find it.
Okay,
but there's not necessarily, these are all the AAPI properties.
wouldn't it, this is a brainstorm, so I'm picking my kid up from taking his SAT test at University High School, which I have did several times. And, I'm waiting around, and wouldn't it be cool if there was like a little tile with a QR code? And the QR code takes me to this site that says, this is associated with, aside from all the other history, this is associated with this thing. That would be sort of a cool thing.
And this is probably the best property for that to happen, because it was just listed. Its listing date was July 15th. The individual who wrote the nomination is an alumnus of the school, and he had been checking the National Register weekly list practically obsessively, waiting for that listing announcement to come out. And he's like, okay, how soon can we order a plaque? I said, well, you might want to wait for the official letter from the SHPO. You will have the specific language, and then, we can discuss it. So there's this energy and enthusiasm that, he wanted that building recognized. He wanted the Japanese American history recognized, and I'm sure he would be thrilled to create something that would enable people to loop back to our website or maybe some of his own research to fulfill that. And I think over time, that's certainly something that we could see happening. I mean, we have an outreach person in the office. We do a monthly e-post where one of the components of that is designating California. We talk about usually recent listings, but the month of August, the woman who's writing the bulk of the e-post thought, let's focus on craftsmen and arts and crafts architecture. And so sometimes it does pull from older things, but it'd be wonderful to be sort of part of the 21st century with, especially with our recent listings.
But, and so that you're making it more accessible to the public, because this is the thing, I didn't know anything about the Royal Theater being, I don't know what the connection is, but I'd like to know. The John Lautner example of the tramway gas station was exactly the kind of gas station thing that I was talking about. So that's a case where the building itself might connect to several different MPD things. Like it could be a John Lautner thing, but it could also be like a space age gas station thing, right? Like it could fit into more than one category. And then you click on the QR code. Want to know more about John Lautner? Want to know more about space age gas stations? I mean, that would be cool too.
Very cool. And you are absolutely right. The ability to get this information easily in the hands of people who have devices in their hands all the time is a lost opportunity we have yet to tap into, but it is absolutely something we'd love to be able to do to get this information out in a better way, in a more accessible way. Absolutely.
What we do is the back end. We're providing the basic information. It is available online, but often that will start a process that raises awareness at a local level. Actually, one of the properties that was nominated under the AAPI document was the Nisei VFW Hall here in Sacramento. It's a VFW chapter started by Japanese American veterans of World War II. And as a result of the National Register listing, the local government listed on their local register, and now they're undergoing a restoration campaign, and they are leveraging and marketing the fact that they're listed in the National Register and that they're on the local register as a way to highlight the importance of the property and draw donations. So whether it's tourism or a QR code or other ways that cities use to market their historic resources, or that individuals or groups use to draw positive attention to their buildings to rehab historic resources, it starts with this. Where people take it in California is up to them.
Yeah.
We're the beginning of the process.
No, I appreciate that. There's a little bit of this is me being sort of like, oh, this is some really interesting things. Like you mentioned ranching resources, which ties exactly into my idea about aviation resources. And that makes me think about, filmmaking studio kind of resources as an industrial kind of building type, or port resources, because that's another kind of very visual and kind of feeling, like there's a sense, ports have their own kind of vibe, and this is like pretty cool. I mean, when you think about the ways in which you could.
It's simply a matter of time and budget.
Oh, no, I get it.
I want to have an app where while you're sitting there waiting to pick up your kid, you can open your app and it'll say, did you know, Neil, you're around 3 National Historic Landmarks and 2 National Register?
Well, that could be slightly creepy.
Yeah.
I mean, like there's.
Well, if you decide to geocache yourself to.
Right.
Or you could go look and say, I'm at this address, tell me what's around here while I'm waiting.
Right, and there are these apps now that you can have tours like in your ear, and you walk around and you see them, and so if these properties if that resource was somehow connected in, I just thought, wow, I didn't know this. This whole thing is a very interesting idea.
So if we're ready to proceed.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's great.
2 quick things as you went before in. It made me think of another workshop, which is what is on the OHP website? How many clicks deep can you really get and what's in there? It would be a neat thing, because there's so many resources that I've found just looking for everything from super training to whatever have you. And I know that there are a lot of people who are looking for that stuff, and it's difficult for them to find, not for people who go on it regularly.
And also subject to time and budget, that may be subject to change in the near future, so.
Right.
It's a great topic.
The second one is with Mojave National Preserve, when does a district become an MPS? Is there a threshold you had for that example where you just had too many sites that at a lower point were contributing elements, and now they're actual sites and now they're actual nominations, in which case you need a different, larger vehicle to park them in?
It was a combination of factors. I mean, nearly 1 million acres within one district boundary just was so incredibly
That's a lot.
unwieldy.
Yeah.
There is still some private property. There's some in holdings there. So it wouldn't have been entirely a federal nomination if they had drawn the boundary around the
The park
entire
itself.
million acres. Because the Rock Springs Landing Cattle Company had been succeeded by these 3 separate ranches, and actually a 4th one over the Nevada-California state line, it made more sense to look at them certainly within those ranching areas. And then just because of how the property had been used, it was incredibly rural, it was cattle grazing, and so there were these vast swaths of unoccupied land. And then you had like a corral and a watering system, or you had the ranch headquarters. And part of it was just how things were placed on the land, that it made a lot more sense to nominate just those places and not necessarily the thousands of acres in between them.
Got it. And so tribal resources weren't a part of that because you're talking about just the ranching period, even though they're within the boundary.
Does anybody need a break? Yeah, can maybe we take a 10-minute, 15-minute break?
The fancy.
Neil,
letter.
keep asking
We are
questions.
now
It's great.
live.
Okay,
It's really good.
So we reconvened and we'll begin the third part. Now, we've talked about the multiple property document process, and now we're going to focus on how individual nominations are written using the multiple property document approach. And there are a few simple elements that have to be part of a nomination. And I want to make clear that nominating a property under a multiple property document, while it's simpler and shorter, it does not lower the threshold for significance or for historic integrity. They still have to qualify for the National Register as they would for a freestanding nomination. The idea is that because there's already a historic context, that part is simpler, and the idea is to generate more nominations because there's an existing body of knowledge. So with the nomination, the applicant has to identify what multiple property document they're using, including the historic context within that multiple property document, and what property type that they're using. So if there's in the example we talked about earlier, a gas station, if there's a gas station property type, you have to identify that this is under the Route 66 multiple property documents with the property type of gas stations. The property description is actually fairly similar to a regular National Register nomination, but the statement of significance can be much briefer. So on the first page of the nomination, in section 1, you list the name of the related multiple property listing. And then in section 8, in the statement of significance summary paragraph, as mentioned, you include the MPDF, the one that it's nominated under the theme, in this case, making a living, and the property type associated with industry and labor, specifically institutional buildings and sites. This is the example from the Oakland 16th Street Station nomination.
was that building that you showed, that was the Oakland station?
Yes.
Because it kind of looked like Sacramento station, but I guess it's,
A little different, but they're both Southern Pacific, so might be some
Okay.
design similarities. But so these are a comparison between conventional nomination and a multiple property document. The statement of significance only needs to be 1 or 2 pages, identifying the specific background of the property that's being nominated, and then the connection to the NPDF. Versus, or the conventional nomination is 1 or 2 pages, and NPDF could be as short as 1 or 2 paragraphs. Often, applicants will use more because they've done the research generally and they want to include more information, but the threshold for the amount, they can focus on the specifics of that nomination rather than establishing a broader historic context. Photos, for a typical National Register nomination for an individual building, 10 to 12 photos are typically all that's needed for a property. But for a National Register nomination under a multiple property document, as little as 1. Pasadena, as I mentioned earlier, they submitted a whole group of multiple property documents for architecture, and so they sent 10 or 12 nominations for 10 or 12 individual buildings, each had 1 photo. Ordinarily, especially for a nomination regarding architecture, that would be insufficient. But in this case, it is enough because it shows the photo that the building is an example of that type and doesn't need further documentation. And the example here is Sugar Pine Railway logging system, which was one of the federal NPDFs and associated with principally historic archaeology. Sites of logging railroads where most of the railroad no longer had sufficient integrity to create a district. Submitting nominations under cover, you'd use just the regular National Register nomination forms, the 10-900. Reviewing other nominations that are under the cover of an MPDF is highly recommended. There are examples on our actions taken page. Once nominations are reviewed, they're posted on our actions taken page to act as not only a repository of information for the public, but also an archive and templates for future nominations. And so like I said, they have to refer to the MPD to identify the context and the property type. They still need full architectural descriptions, assessment of integrity, and full statements of significance for areas of significance not covered under the MPD. This is another thing a question that has come in recently from members of the public is that the nomination doesn't need to be limited to the MPD areas of significance. But if there are areas of significance that aren't covered by the multiple property document, those require regular size statements of significance. Now, staff, as staff, part of what we do is we reply to public comments and public inquiries. We don't review draft nominations until they're actually submitted, but we can provide technical support for people who are asking, how do I use this approach? How do I fill in this or that part of the nomination? But we don't really go into depth until you're ready to submit. But even if there are outstanding issues, as long as it's complete when it arrives, we respond with a request for information.
This is the appendix to the AAPI in California multiple property document I referenced earlier. It's 2 pages and it just gives a brief overview of understanding what historic context is, a little bit of information about the process, kind of our very simple equation that eligibility for the National Register is a combination of significance and integrity. We talk a little bit about completing the form, our process of review and revision, when the nomination comes before you as the commission, and then the idea that there is still this additional step where the keeper of the National Register reviews documentation and makes the final determination. So we're going to talk a bit now about amendments, because just as individual National Register nominations can be amended as more information becomes available, so too can the multiple property documentation form. So when to amend is based on the prospect of additional information, whether that's additional historic context, additional property types, if the geographic area might change. Perhaps the period of significance changes or the registration requirements. This would also involve updates to identification and evaluation methods and or major bibliographical references. So using AAPI as an example, we saw some very significant additions to the amended multiple property documentation form, adding another group, adding additional historic context. We certainly saw a great deal of additional information in the bibliography, extending the period of significance meant that maybe some additional resources would then become eligible. How to, right on the front page of the form is a place to mark that it is an amended submission as opposed to an original submission. Multiple sections can be revised, sometimes just one section needs to be revised. And in most cases, when an amended multiple property documentation form comes through, we usually would expect to see at least one individual nomination accompanying it, usually whatever's driving the reason for the amendment. Again, in the case of AAPI, because there were already a number of nominations that had been listed under cover of that document, and we were very clearly making a case, our reviewer at the National Park Service actually said, no, the amendment can come in by itself. With Latinos in 20th Century California, we have had the opportunity to amend that document a couple of times. Once we had a nomination come in for some sculptures, and in looking at how the multiple property document had originally been written, art only seemed to refer to two-dimensional art. It was a reference to murals. And so we did an amendment that would allow for three-dimensional art to be included under cover of that document. Another situation a number of years ago, there was a group in Southern California that wanted to submit a series of nominations related to the Chicano moratorium. And they wanted to submit their own multiple property documentation form. And staff's first response was, why? You have the Latinos in 20th century California. Well, they were somewhat insistent and they wanted their own independent submittal. They felt it would give them perhaps more visibility. So the independent multiple property documentation form and the nominations got to the keeper of the National Register, who said, why? You should be nominating this under cover of the Latinos in 20th century California. So it came back around. We assisted them with adding a historic context to the existing multiple property documentation form. And now actually that amended documentation may serve for the Chicano walkouts nominations coming in. They too did something similar. They wanted to submit their own multiple property. And we said, you don't need to do that extra work. You have this existing documentation. And so there may be a little bit of revision to that specific historic context, and it may turn out that they're able to use it as it is. So again, it's a flexible document. The idea is that it can adapt and change. And then once that is completed, it follows the standard process. It comes before the commission, gets signed off by the SHPO, and is submitted to the keeper of the National Register for final determination.
The projector in the room is no longer functioning. The only way to set it up is to stop the webinar, so I'm sorry.
Can we just turn it off then?
I don't know how.
Okay.
Well, we're down to just 2 more pages of the presentation.
And the folks online can still see the presentation.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a number of dedicated pages, particularly for the 4 statewide documentation forms that we've been discussing. So people can either enter these terms in as a search term, or you can find them specifically on the 4th item here, National Register Multiple Property Submission Context for California. And for those who are not able to see the screen, I've also included as digital resources the web address for the National Register of Historic Places on the National Park Service website, the Office of Historic Preservation website, and registration programs on the OHP website.
And if you're watching this video on YouTube, the summary underneath the video screen will have these links embedded.
And that concludes our presentation.
Okay, well.
Amazing. Questions? Caleb?
Yes, to clarify, if an NPDF does not have a dedicated page, what would you suggest someone do to find it? Yes.
If an NPDF doesn't have a dedicated page, they won't be able to find it, but there's a page that includes all currently listed California NPDFs, although not all of them were scanned and some of them aren't able to be posted because of state requirements regarding accessible documents.
Understood.
What about criteria considerations? Do they have to tie into the NPDF on the individual ones coming in, or can it all be nomination specific?
I'm not sure what you mean.
So if there are criteria considerations for nominations underneath an NPS, they can be nomination specific. They don't have to already have a consideration in the NPS for that to happen.
Right, the registration requirements address all of the criteria, potential criteria considerations. Criteria consideration G, properties whose period of significance ends less than 50 years ago, is probably the most frequent one we see there. But like some of the multiple property documents we've done so far will address cemeteries or birthplaces, and again, those are also items that or property types that would require a criteria consideration. So again, those are nomination specific. There is usually some sort of general overview provided in the multiple property documentation form.
Nominations for properties that would normally not be eligible because of criteria consideration could still, there's no exemption because they're included in NPDF. So a property that exceeds significance within the last 50 years still needs to meet the requirements of criteria consideration G for acceptable significance, etc. Moved properties would have to still be eligible despite their moved status. It doesn't exempt consideration of criteria.
Thanks. No, you got it. I didn't ask it yet, but thank you.
Maybe you covered this, but could you tag an MPDF to an existing registered project without adding a new one?
So if there's, so say if it was already a listed property, could you amend the nomination to be inclusive of an MPDF? I think that's actually one of the things that the commission's document did.
No, I think he means,
Let's say you wanted to do one on Julia Morgan. I suspect most of Julia Morgan's projects in California are already listed.
Essentially, so a new MPDF based on
Julia Morgan.
association with Julia Morgan, that would have, I don't know offhand whether or how many of her properties that might be eligible aren't listed.
I know, that's what I'm thinking, but even if there weren't any, if there were zero, wouldn't there be a value in having this?
If there were zero, then there would be great value, and in creating an MPDF to nominate them under. This is similar to other.
No, I mean, if there are no more left,
Oh,
like.
They've all been listed.
They've all been listed, 100% of them have been
if
listed.
they've all been listed, then there's nothing left to nominate.
Okay, well.
I think your question might have been too, if I might say that we've nominated this building under Native American history. And it also has a context under Asian Pacific Islanders in 20th century for some strange reason. Is there's no way for us to know that automatically unless somebody amends the nomination for that context, correct?
If the nomination includes that context, whether or not it's under the cover of the multiple
Right.
property document, then it includes that context. We mentioned the.
But they're not automatically tagged, is I think the question.
Right, we mentioned the Nisei VFW Hall here in Sacramento. It was originally designed as a restaurant for an African-American restaurateur and member of the Elks. And so it was listed under the AAPI MPDF, but it also had an African-American history context, but it isn't necessary to amend it to associate it with the African-American statewide context, which came later.
It would be nice eventually to be able to say existing nominations also have this context. But we're not there yet.
Okay, yeah.
It seems like this was designed to make the process more efficient, yet the dog hole courts, as you say, they kind of ignored and wanted to make sure their story was told per nomination, which I get. It's either that or we want to have our own MPDF, and there's nothing you can do about it because that's what we want to do. A lot of that is dependent on public funding, or grants, which we know have had a lot of trouble in the historic preservation space this year. Where do you see this program going or changing in the next couple of years? Do you see it being the same based on the way it's been, or because of either funding issues or other challenges, do you see any hiccups or things that would make MPDFs more difficult to nominate?
I think we've probably seen as many of the big statewide ethnic heritage ones that we might see for a while. Just because we've covered a lot of groups, there's a lot more out there. I think we're more likely to see amendments to existing multiple property documents. Shippo mentioned that some of the Native American tribal historic preservation officers are interested in adding some contexts, maybe to facilitate the nomination of additional resources. I think we've already proven that both Latinos and AAPI are very amenable to being amended. There's probably still the potential for either some architect or architecture specific multiple property documents. But yeah, I don't know that anybody is out there saying, I think I'll start an MPDF today.
Well, it has to do with, there has to be an advocate, right? I mean, in my example of the aviation industry, you'd have to have a group or someone who thinks having this is possible, that there's enough out there to, and interested in spending the time and doing it. And that, there might be, I mean, there's a lot of aviation kind of nerds out there, so who knows, but, what's that? Oh, no, I'm sorry. But I don't know, I mean, that's part of it, right? So a cultural group, you can imagine there's more of a latent sort of desire.
It's a question of investment of time and
Yeah.
resources. Any MPDF is generally going to be a lot more time and resources. It's, quite frankly, it's more difficult to complete one of these than to do an individual nomination. So if your objective as a group or an individual is to save this building or that, or landmark this place or that, you're gonna focus on that rather, but you really, unless you are an organization with a longer view and a broader scope that thinks it's worthwhile to start with an MPDF and then encourage nominations under it. And as the state, we have an advantage there of a broader scope that a smaller organization might not have. But as we've already seen, there are some cities that were really proactive about creating many of these to facilitate nominations.
I think to answer your question though too, Adam, there never has been a big pipeline to fund these. So there's nothing to dry up really. There's been the underrepresented communities grants out of the National Park Service that we've seen it tapering off over years, and I think that those are in the 2026 federal budget zeroed out.
Yeah.
We have not funded ours solely from federal grants in that sense. So they're not all underrepresented community grants. The ones that we have received for Latinos in the 20th century and maybe one of the others funded a portion of the total amount that it takes to get these statewide efforts done. So they've been mostly funded by budget savings on our part. So we've sort of watched our waistline, and then when the end of the year, we set the contracts out with remaining funds to do them for the next year. So we've been consciously saving our pennies and funding them and with intent, not from any external sources. But there isn't really a known, or there hasn't been an identified funding pipeline for these documents per se.
For public dollars, for grants and.
Or federal funds for that matter, yeah. Yeah. But there's enough, I mean, to Amy's point, there's enough out there that they're very useful tools. It's just a matter of getting them out there for people to know that they exist and how to use them. So I think that will be part of our, I mean, I know that that's part of our intended outreach over the next years, is to try to really get them out there for people to know and use as best we can.
If either one of you could pick one that hasn't been developed yet, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this would be great to come in and it would cover the next 15 years of nominations under that category, what would it be?
I'd have to give that a bit more thought.
Okay.
She'll give you the answer tomorrow.
A lot of cities in California have produced citywide historic context statements about LGBTQ plus history.
Okay.
So that's one potential future statewide MPDF. California has that history.
Mm-hmm.
I would say
Every state has that history.
aerospace or high tech as well.
Yeah.
I mean, high tech is coming along now, but it has a history as well.
Yeah.
And we're losing buildings even as we talk.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's interesting. I don't think of high-tech buildings going back that far. So
They do.
maybe they do.
Jobs as garage.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, like what,
But that's on the register.
I don't mean to distract us, but could you tweak what do you have in mind there?
Okay. Google Walt Disney's Burbank Studio, opened
I
in
see.
1939.
Got it.
It is the template for everything that's going on in Silicon Valley today. So, and
Oh, I was thinking of them for a studio, the Hollywood industry one. They could overlap.
no, also,
Yeah.
but no, for creating a work environment that promotes creative thinking, not only in the arts, but in new technology, applying new technology.
Do entertainment generally include theme parks like Disneyland and
Yeah.
the up and down the coast things, and I mean, there's a lot, I agree, and I think too, Alan, maybe because you're in the mid-century sort of modern area of not a lot of scholarship, but not a lot of cohesiveness, and buildings being removed or changed at significant rates, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see, how the tribes see this document as a vehicle for their history, and
Yeah.
whether that's something that tribes will be more engaged with going forward as well, as another avenue to.
Outside of the mission context?
Yeah,
That's the part of Five Views that isn't fully complete yet, is NPDFs associated with prehistory.
Mm.
And you mentioned technology. The high-tech industry of the 19th century in California was railroads. And as I mentioned, California doesn't have a railroad multiple property document yet.
Yeah.
well done.
Very
This
good.
is great.
Thank you. Anything else? So tomorrow we're at the Secretary of State's auditorium, 9:00. And, so don't go to the Resources Agency building because we won't be there. And it's about a 15-minute walk from your hotel.
This is the Secretary of State. We were there once before,
I think.
where we got the tour of their,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Do we have anybody online, Jody, for questions?
Nope, we're listening. Thanks, everyone.
Good. How many people did we have online?
Are we ready to stop?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks,
Well
everybody.
done, you guys.
Tune in tomorrow.
Yeah.